The snow did not simply fall, it was driven like rusted iron nails, flying horizontally across the desolate, jagged expanse of the northern spine. It was a tempest born of malice, a howling, shrieking entity that sought to scour the warmth from every living thing unfortunate enough to be caught outside the tree line. The wind tore through the ancient pines, transforming their frozen needles into a chorus of mournful screams, while the ground itself lay buried under feet of compacted, treacherous ice. In this barren wasteland, the cold was not merely a temperature. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that crushed the air from the lungs and slowed the blood to a sluggish, agonizing crawl. To breathe was to swallow glass. To blink was to risk the eyelashes freezing together in a permanent, icy seal. Nothing moved. Nothing survived. The world was dead, buried under a monolithic shroud of blinding, unforgiving white. Yet, against the agonizing resistance of the gale, a solitary figure forged a path. The hunter was a massive, hulking shape against the storm, swathed in layers of heavy wool, cured leather, and the thick, coarse furs of dire wolves and snow bears. His boots, strapped with iron spikes, crunched methodically into the hardpack, each step a calculated expenditure of precious energy. He moved with the slow, inevitable rhythm of a glacier, his head bowed, his face entirely obscured by a heavy cowl and a scarf crusted with the frozen moisture of his own breath. He carried a heavy yew bow across his back, its string unstrung and carefully wrapped against the damp, and a broad-bladed hand axe hung at his hip. He was a man of the deep woods, a creature of silence and survival, long accustomed to the brutal indifference of the northern winters. But even he knew that this storm was different. This was a true whiteout, a death-bringer. He needed to reach his cabin, the only sanctuary within 100 miles before the fading light died completely and the temperature plummeted to a degree that would shatter bone. It was only by the grace of his relentless, sweeping gaze that he saw the anomaly in the snowdrifts. A mound, slightly darker than the surrounding white, partially obscured by the shifting dunes of frost. It was not a rock, nor was it the fallen trunk of a tree. It possessed the tragic, unmistakable geometry of a fallen body. The hunter paused, leaning against the wind, his eyes narrowing beneath his frosted brow. He did not hesitate for long. Duty to the silent laws of the wild compelled him. He altered his course, trudging through snow that reached his thighs, fighting the resistance of the drifts until he reached the mound. Kneeling heavily in the snow, he used his thick, fur-gloved hands to sweep away the fresh powder, revealing the frozen tragedy beneath. It was an orc, a female. The hunter had seen the brutal, warring clans of the southern plains, but it was incredibly rare to find one this far north, let alone isolated and dying in a blizzard. Her skin, which should have held the rich, vibrant olive hues of her kin, was pallid and terrifyingly gray, marred by the deep, bruised purple of advanced frostbite. She was dressed in rags, pitifully thin layers of torn linen and hardened leather that offered absolutely no protection against the biting cold. Her armor, if she ever had any, was gone. More telling, however, were the fresh, jagged scars across her shoulders and arms, not the honorable marks of battle, but the brutal, tearing wounds of a brand. She had been banished, cast out, stripped of her clan, her name, and her right to the communal fires of her people, sent into the frozen wastes to die. The cruelty of it was evident in the way she had curled into a tight fetal ball, trying desperately to preserve a spark of warmth that had long since abandoned her. The hunter reached out, his heavy glove brushing against her cheek. It was like touching solid marble. He pulled off his right glove, the biting wind immediately gnawing at his bare flesh, and pressed his 2 middle fingers against the side of her thick, corded neck, just below the curve of her prominent jaw and her chipped lower tusks. For a long, terrifying moment, there was nothing, only the cold, unforgiving silence of the dead. Then, incredibly faint, a sluggish, desperate thud against his fingertips. And another. She was clinging to life by the absolute narrowest of margins, her powerful heart refusing to surrender even as her body shut down around it. He did not speak. There was no one to hear him, and words were useless against the storm. Action was the only language the winter understood. Working with practiced, urgent efficiency, he unclasped his heavy outer cloak, a massive, sprawling thing of dire bear fur that weighed as much as a small deer, and spread it over the snow. He slipped his arms under her frozen, rigid body, grunting with the immense effort as he lifted her dead weight. She was incredibly heavy, dense with muscle and bone, but he hoisted her up and laid her gently onto the center of the fur. He wrapped the heavy cloak around her, swaddling her tightly to trap whatever minuscule body heat she had left, and secured the bundle with thick leather straps from his pack. Hoisting the bundle over his broad shoulders, he adjusted the agonizing weight, finding his center of gravity, and turned his face back into the teeth of the blizzard. The journey back to the cabin was an exercise in pure, unadulterated suffering. Every step was a battle against the thigh-deep snow, every breath a searing agony in his chest. The weight of the orc girl pressed down upon him, threatening to drive him into the drifts to perish alongside her. The wind screamed its fury, battering against him, trying to push him off the narrow, invisible trail he navigated solely by memory and instinct. The light faded entirely, plunging the world into a chaotic, swirling darkness, a maelstrom of blinding white and pitch black. He marched on through the void, a solitary engine of will, his mind retreating into a blank, rhythmic chant of survival. Left foot, right foot. Breathe. Do not stop. To stop was to die. To rest was to sleep forever. He felt the cold seeping through his inner layers, creeping up his limbs, whispering promises of peace and rest if he would only just lie down. He ignored it, gritting his teeth, focusing only on the agonizing burn in his thighs and the heavy, reassuring weight of the life he carried on his back. It felt like hours, perhaps days, before the massive, dark shape of the cabin finally materialized from the swirling gloom. Built into the side of a rocky hill sheltered by a dense grove of ancient evergreens, it was a fortress of thick, unhewn cedar logs, chinked with hardened mud and moss. The roof was heavy with snow, acting as natural insulation, and the thick oak door was a barrier against the darkness of the world. The hunter staggered onto the small covered porch, his legs finally threatening to buckle. He leaned heavily against the timber frame, gasping for air, the frost on his face cracking as his jaw worked. With fumbling, numb fingers, he undid the heavy iron latch and pushed the door open. The interior was pitch black and bone-chillingly cold, but it was still. The absence of the howling wind was a physical relief, a sudden, deafening quiet that roared in his ears. He stumbled inside, kicking the door shut behind him and throwing the heavy iron bolt. He lowered the bundled orc girl onto the large woven rug that dominated the center of the room, taking care not to drop her abruptly. His own body was screaming for rest, his limbs shaking violently from the exertion and the cold, but he knew the true battle had just begun. He could not afford to collapse. He moved entirely by rote memory in the pitch darkness, his boots scuffing against the wide wooden floorboards. He found the heavy wooden table, struck a flint and steel, and touched the spark to a tallow candle. A small, warm halo of golden light bloomed, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but deeply lived in, a testament to a solitary life meticulously maintained. Bunches of dried herbs and salted meats hung from the heavy rafters. A sturdy wooden bed piled high with furs occupied one corner, while a large, heavy oak table and 2 chairs sat in another. Shelves lined with jars of preserved roots, berries, and rendered fats climbed the walls. But the heart of the cabin, its very soul, was the massive fieldstone hearth that dominated the far wall. It was cold and dark now, smelling faintly of old wood smoke and ash. The hunter immediately went to the hearth. He knelt before the blackened stones, sweeping aside the dead ashes to reveal the carefully preserved, dry tinder he had laid out before leaving that morning. He piled handfuls of fine, dry birch bark shavings and small, brittle twigs into a loose pyramid. Striking his flint again, he coaxed a spark into the nest of bark. He blew on it softly, a long, steady breath, watching the tiny red ember eat into the dry wood, blossoming into a fragile, blue-edged flame. He fed it carefully, patiently, adding slightly larger twigs of pine, listening to the sharp, crackling pops as the sap ignited. Once the small fire was established, he laid a split log of seasoned oak across the grate, watching the flames lick hungrily up the sides of the dry wood. Only when the fire was burning steadily, beginning to push back the freezing gloom with its flickering golden warmth, did he return to the bundle on the floor. He knelt beside her, his breath pluming in the still freezing air of the cabin. He unfastened the leather straps and peeled back the heavy bear fur. She lay completely motionless, a gray, frozen statue. Her breathing was so shallow it was imperceptible, and the terrible purple hue of her lips and fingertips seemed more pronounced in the firelight. He knew that if he warmed her too quickly, the shock to her heart would kill her instantly. It had to be slow. It had to be agonizingly deliberate. He moved back and forth from the hearth, dragging the heavy woven rug closer to the fire, but not too close. He lifted her rigid form again and placed her gently on the rug, bathing her in the soft, ambient warmth rather than the direct, searing heat of the flames. He began the arduous process of removing her frozen, sodden rags. The cheap linen was glued to her skin by ice, and he had to work incredibly carefully, using a small, razor-sharp skinning knife to slice the garments away without cutting her frostbitten flesh. Beneath the rags, her body was a map of tragedy. The brand marks on her shoulders were angry and infected, standing out starkly against her graying, muscular physique. She was severely malnourished, the heavy, powerful ribs of her species visible beneath the taut skin, her powerful abdominal muscles sunken and hollow. She was a warrior, brought impossibly low. He stripped off his own heavy outer furs and gloves, leaving him in a thick woolen tunic and trousers, and retrieved several large, dry woolen blankets from an iron-bound chest near his bed. He wrapped her entirely in the dry wool, cocooning her tightly, leaving only her face exposed. Then he fetched a large iron kettle, filled it with fresh snow from a bucket by the door, and swung it on the iron arm over the roaring fire to melt. He stood back for a moment, wiping a hand across his exhausted, sweat and frost-streaked face. His muscles ached with a deep, throbbing intensity, but the work was not done. He took a heavy iron poker and shifted the logs, building the fire higher, feeding it thick chunks of dense hickory and oak until the hearth roared like a captive beast, throwing a brilliant, life-giving heat into the room. The process of thawing was a violent, ugly thing. As the ambient warmth of the cabin slowly penetrated her frozen tissues, the blood began to circulate, forcing its way through narrowed, damaged veins. The orc girl began to tremble, softly at first, a barely perceptible vibration beneath the heavy woolen blankets. Then, the trembling escalated into violent, involuntary shivers, her teeth chattering so hard the sound echoed in the quiet cabin. It was a good sign. It meant her body was fighting back, trying to generate its own heat, but it was also agonizing. She let out a low, guttural moan, a sound of profound, animalistic suffering, her eyes squeezing tightly shut as the pain of the thawing flesh washed over her. The hunter remained entirely silent, stoic and immovable. He moved around the cabin with quiet purpose. He took a small, clean linen cloth, dipped it into the kettle of warm, melted snow water, and wrung it out. Kneeling beside her, he gently pressed the warm cloth to her forehead, wiping away the melting frost and grime. He applied the warm compress to her cheeks, the bridge of her nose, and her lips, repeating the process over and over, slowly raising the surface temperature of her skin. She flinched away from the touch, a reflex of deep-seated fear and pain, a soft growl vibrating in her chest. He did not pull back, nor did he press harder. He merely held the cloth steady, his touch firm, impersonal, and undeniably gentle. "Hush," he murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble, the first word spoken in the cabin. It was a sound like stones grinding together, rarely used, but imbued with a calm, grounding authority. The worst is over. She did not understand him, or perhaps the pain was too great for comprehension. She twisted in the blankets, her powerful muscles bunching as she tried to pull away from the burning agony in her extremities. The hunter placed a heavy, reassuring hand on her shoulder, pinning her gently to the rug. He held her there, a mountain of immovable calm against her desperate thrashing, until the violent shivering began to subside into long, shuddering gasps. The gray pallor of her skin slowly began to recede, replaced by an angry, flushed red as the blood aggressively returned to the surface. Her chest rose and fell more deeply, the rattling, shallow breaths replaced by the heavy, rhythmic intake of air. He left her side to tend the fire again, adding more wood, ensuring the heat remained a constant, oppressive blanket in the room. He took a handful of dried herbs, yarrow for the fever he knew was coming, willow bark for the pain, and a pungent, bitter root that stimulated the blood, and tossed them into a smaller copper pot hanging over a secondary, cooler flame. He added water and let it steep, the earthy, medicinal smell quickly filling the small cabin, masking the metallic scent of snow and sweat. Hours bled into one another. The storm outside raged on, an unending siege against the heavy log walls. The wind shrieked and battered the heavy wooden shutters over the small, thick-glassed windows, occasionally finding a tiny gap to whistle through, sending a sharp draft of freezing air across the floorboards. But inside, the fire burned triumphant. The cabin grew uncomfortably warm for the hunter, who was accustomed to the chill, but he did not open a vent. The heat was her only medicine now. He sat in a heavy wooden chair beside her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, watching her intently. He watched the way the firelight danced across the sharp planes of her face, highlighting the brutal architecture of her cheekbones and the fierce slope of her brow. He watched the steady, reassuring rise and fall of her chest beneath the thick wool. He was a man who lived entirely in solitude, who spoke to the trees and the wind more often than to other living souls. He knew the tracks of the deer, the habits of the wolves, the changing of the seasons. But the presence of this broken, exiled warrior in his sanctuary was a profoundly foreign weight. He felt no pity for her. Pity was an insult to survival. He felt only a quiet, resolute determination to see the job finished. He had pulled her from the jaws of the winter. He would not let her slip back into the dark. Sometime deep in the endless night, her eyes opened. They were startling. Even in the dim, flickering light of the hearth, the hunter could see they were a vivid, burning amber, like the glowing coals of the fire itself. They were wide, dilated with pain and confusion, darting frantically around the unfamiliar surroundings. She tried to sit up, a sudden violent movement born of panic, but her muscles, entirely exhausted and aching with a deep cellular pain, refused to obey. She managed only to lift her head before falling back against the rug with a pained grunt. Her breathing hitched, accelerating into a rapid, panicked rhythm. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto the massive figure sitting in the shadows beside her. The hunter did not move. He remained perfectly still, his hands resting easily on his knees, projecting an aura of absolute, unthreatening calm. He knew she was an animal backed into a corner, wounded, traumatized, and expecting the worst. In her world, weakness was an invitation for the blade. Finding herself helpless in the lair of a stranger, a human, no less, must have been a waking nightmare. She opened her mouth, exposing her chipped tusks and the flat, grinding teeth of an omnivore, and let out a low, warning hiss. It was a pathetic sound, devoid of strength, but heavy with desperate intent. She shifted beneath the blankets, her hands scrabbling weakly for a weapon that was not there, her eyes wild and feral. "It's freezing," the hunter told the banished orc girl. His voice was quiet, steady, betraying no alarm. He did not raise his hands in surrender, nor did he make any sudden movements that could be construed as an attack. He simply sat there, a fixed point in her chaotic, spinning world. He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the heavy oak door where frost was beginning to form on the inside of the iron hinges, a stark testament to the lethal temperatures outside. Then he pointed to the roaring fire in the hearth. "You stay. You live. You go out there." He let the sentence hang, the implication heavier than the snow on the roof. She stared at him, her amber eyes wide, her chest heaving. She looked at the door, listening to the muffled, demonic shrieking of the wind against the logs. She looked at the fire, feeling its radiant heat seeping into her aching, shivering bones. And then she looked back at him. She saw the heavy lines of his face, the gray streaking his thick, dark beard, the deep crow's feet around his dark, impassive eyes. She saw the sheer size of him, realizing with a cold certainty that if he had wanted her dead, he would not have needed to bring her here. He could have just let the winter have her. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. Her head rolled back, her eyes fluttering shut. She did not trust him. She expected pain. She expected betrayal. But the warmth was undeniable and the fatigue was absolute. She surrendered to the dark, slipping back into a deep, healing unconsciousness. The hunter let out a slow, quiet breath. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room, and moved to the hearth. He took a heavy wooden bowl, filled it with the dark, aromatic broth from the copper pot, and set it on the table to cool. Then he returned to his chair, folded his arms across his broad chest, and prepared to watch over her for the rest of the long, dark night. The next morning, if one could call the subtle graying of the light filtering through the window cracks a morning, brought a change in the atmosphere. The storm had not broken, but it had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the cabin, a constant, oppressive reminder of their isolation. The orc girl woke slowly. The agonizing, sharp pain of the thaw had subsided into a deep, dull ache that radiated from her bones. She felt impossibly heavy, as if her limbs were made of lead. She opened her eyes, immediately squinting against the bright, cheerful glow of the fire. She was alone in the main room. The heavy wooden door to the outside was closed and bolted. She lay perfectly still, listening. She heard the crackle of the logs, the whistling of the wind, and from the small, attached lean-to shed, the rhythmic, heavy thud crack of an axe biting into wood. She tried to move. It took immense effort, a sheer act of willpower to force her arms to push her torso up from the floor. She sat up, the heavy woolen blankets falling away to reveal the oversized, coarse linen shirt she had been dressed in, undoubtedly belonging to the human. It was thick and warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine needles. She pulled her knees to her chest, wincing at the stiffness in her joints, and examined her surroundings with a more lucid, tactical eye. The cabin was immaculately organized. Everything had a purpose, a place. It was the dwelling of a survivor, a pragmatist. There were no decorative trinkets, only the beautiful, brutal efficiency of well-crafted tools. She saw the massive yew bow unstrung on the wall, the quiver of heavy, broadhead arrows. She saw the skinning knives, honed to a mirror finish, hanging on a leather strip. She recognized the scent of the dried herbs, the quality of the salted meat. This human was not a soft, town-dwelling creature. He was a predator. Yet, he had brought her here. He had stripped her of her frozen, wet rags, clothed her in warm, dry wool, and built a fire that must have taken a significant portion of his winter wood reserves to maintain. It made absolutely no sense to her. In her world, the weak were left behind. The wounded were a burden. Altruism was a myth invented by those too cowardly to face the harsh realities of survival. The heavy thudding from the shed stopped. She tensed, her muscles locking, her hand instinctively reaching out to grab a heavy piece of firewood from the small pile near the hearth. She gripped it tightly, ready to defend herself, ready to fight to her last breath. The heavy inner door opened and the hunter stepped into the cabin. He brought a wave of freezing air with him, his breath pluming as he kicked the snow off his boots. He was carrying an armful of split birch logs, his shoulders dusted with fresh snow. He saw her immediately, sitting upright, clutching the firewood like a club, her eyes wide and feral. He stopped. He did not drop the wood, nor did he reach for the axe hanging at his belt. He looked at her, then looked at the piece of wood in her hand, and slowly, deliberately, averted his eyes. He walked over to the hearth, completely turning his back to her, a colossal display of either supreme confidence or utter foolishness in her eyes, and knelt to place the fresh logs near the fire. "You won't need that," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated in the small room. He did not turn around to face her. "Unless you plan to stoke the fire, in which case, use the poker. The wood will burn your hands." He stood up, dusted his hands on his trousers, and walked over to the small iron stove where the copper pot still hung. He poured a generous measure of the dark broth into a heavy wooden bowl. He picked up a thick, roughly carved wooden spoon, placed it in the bowl, and walked toward her. She shrank back instinctively, pressing herself against the floorboards, her grip on the firewood tightening until her knuckles turned a lighter shade of pale green. She bared her teeth, a silent warning. He stopped several feet away. He slowly crouched down, maintaining a respectable distance, and placed the bowl on the floorboards between them. The steam rose in fragrant, curling wisps, carrying the rich, salty scent of marrow, meat, and bitter herbs. Her stomach betrayed her, emitting a loud, painful rumble that echoed in the quiet cabin. She had not eaten in days, perhaps a week. The scent was maddening, overriding her instincts of self-preservation. "Drink," he said simply. He stood up, turning his back on her once more, and walked over to his large wooden table. He sat down, pulled a whetstone and a small knife from his pocket, and began to rhythmically, methodically sharpen the blade. Shk, shk, shk. She stared at the bowl, then at the broad, unmoving back of the human. She could not comprehend this dynamic. He was offering her food, warmth, and he was ignoring her, giving her space, demanding nothing in return. It was a trap. It had to be. She waited, watching him for any sudden movement, any sign of deception. He simply continued to sharpen the knife, the rhythmic sound acting as a strange, hypnotic counterpoint to the howling storm outside. Slowly, agonizingly, hunger won out over caution. She lowered the piece of firewood, her hand trembling slightly. She crept forward on her hands and knees, keeping her eyes fixed on his back. She reached out, grasped the warm wooden bowl and pulled it back into her lap. She did not use the spoon. She lifted the bowl to her lips with both hands and drank deeply. The broth was incredibly hot, scalding her tongue, but she did not care. It was rich and salty, bursting with the intense, savory flavor of long-simmered bone marrow and sharp medicinal roots. It hit her empty stomach like a stone, sending a sudden, powerful wave of heat and energy radiating outward through her chilled body. It was the most magnificent thing she had ever tasted. She drained the bowl in seconds, gasping for air as she lowered it, a thin trickle of broth escaping the corner of her mouth and running down her chin. She looked up, expecting him to be watching her, mocking her hunger. But he was still focused entirely on his knife, the whetstone sliding smoothly over the steel. He had not turned around. He had given her the dignity of eating in private. A profound, confusing silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the scrape of the whetstone, and the unending rage of the winter outside. It was the beginning of an incredibly long, agonizingly slow period of convalescence. The storm did not break for 6 days. For 6 days, the world outside was a white, screaming void, effectively shrinking their entire existence down to the 20 by 20-foot interior of the cabin. During those days, a strange, unspoken routine developed. The hunter was a creature of immense discipline. He woke before the meager light touched the windows, stoking the fire, melting snow for water, and preparing a simple, hearty meal of oats and dried berries or sliced salted meat. He always made enough for two, always pouring her portion into the same heavy wooden bowl, always placing it on the floor near her makeshift bed before turning his back to eat his own meal at the table. She spent the first 3 days entirely on the woven rug near the hearth. The fever he had anticipated hit her hard on the second day. She tossed and turned, her heavy, muscular body slick with sweat, caught in the grip of terrifying, disjointed nightmares of her banishment. She dreamed of the branding irons, the jeering faces of her former clan, the horrific, agonizing march into the blinding white nothingness. Throughout it all, whenever she surfaced from the delirium, she found the hunter there. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply pressed a cool, damp cloth to her forehead, held a cup of bitter medicinal tea to her lips, and physically restrained her with his immense strength when the nightmares caused her to thrash too violently, ensuring she did not injure herself. His hands were always firm, rough with calluses, but undeniably gentle. They were the hands of a man who knew how to kill, but chose to heal. By the 4th day, the fever broke. She awoke feeling hollowed out, weak as a newborn pup, but clear-headed. The agonizing pain in her extremities had settled into a dull, manageable throb, though the tips of her fingers and toes remained numb and slightly discolored. She watched him as he moved about the cabin. She observed his economy of motion. He never wasted a step, never made a sound louder than necessary. He was chopping root vegetables at the table, his heavy knife moving with terrifying rhythmic precision. She sat up, pulling the heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, to ask why he had saved her, but her throat was dry, and the guttural, harsh language of her people felt wrong in the quiet, peaceful air of the cabin. She did not know the human tongue, though she understood the intent behind his sparse words. He finished chopping the roots, swept them into a wooden bowl, and walked over to the hearth to add them to the ever-present pot of stew. As he passed her, he paused. He looked down at her, his dark eyes unreadable beneath his heavy brow. "You ought healing," he observed quietly. It was not a question. She looked up at him, her amber eyes meeting his. She gave a short, sharp nod. He nodded back, a slow, deliberate movement. He turned and poured a measure of water into a wooden basin, setting it on a low stool near the fire. He laid a clean, coarse linen towel next to it, along with a small, round lump of rough gray soap that smelled strongly of lye and pine sap. He did not say anything, simply walking back to the table and resuming his work, systematically oiling the string of his heavy yew bow. She looked at the basin of water, the steam rising invitingly in the cold air. She understood the offering. Slowly, painfully, she stood up. Her legs trembled violently, her center of balance completely off after days of lying prone. She swayed, grabbing the stone mantle of the hearth to steady herself. The hunter did not rush to help her. He watched her from the corner of his eye, ensuring she did not fall, but he allowed her the victory of standing on her own. She washed. The water was gloriously warm, washing away the sweat, the grime, and the lingering metallic stench of near death. The soap was harsh, stinging the healing skin around her brands, but it felt incredibly cleansing. As she scrubbed the ash and dirt from her arms, she traced the raised, jagged lines of the scars. They were ugly, furious red marks, a permanent declaration of her unworthiness. In her culture, to be unbranded was to be whole. To be branded and cast out was to be worse than dead. It was to be erased. She scrubbed harder, as if she could wash the shame away, her breath hitching in her chest, a low, frustrated sound escaping her lips. The sound of the bowstring being snapped into place echoed sharply in the room. She jumped, spinning around, pulling the heavy blanket tight around her wet body. The hunter was standing, the massive bow flexed in his hands, checking the tension. He looked at her, his gaze dropping briefly to the angry red scars on her shoulders before returning to her eyes. He did not offer pity. He did not look away in disgust. He simply stared, his expression perfectly neutral, before slowly unstringing the bow and hanging it back on the wall. "Scars mean you survived the wound," he said quietly, his back to her. "Nothing more, nothing less." He walked to the door, pulled his heavy dire bear cloak from the wooden peg, and threw it over his shoulders. "I need to check the snares in the lean-to. Stay by the fire." He opened the door, letting in a ferocious blast of swirling white snow and screaming wind, and stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him with a heavy thud. She stood there by the fire, dripping wet, the rough towel in her hands. She replayed his words in her mind, turning them over, examining them. "Scars mean you survived." It was a remarkably practical, brutally simple way of looking at it. It stripped away the shame, the cultural weight of the punishment, leaving only the biological fact of endurance. She looked down at the red welts again, tracing them with a slightly less frantic finger. She was alive. The fire crackled cheerfully behind her, casting a warm, golden glow across her damp olive skin. For the first time since she had been dragged before the clan elders and cast out into the ice, she felt a tiny, fragile spark of something that was not despair. It was not hope, not yet, but it was a profound, grounding sense of present reality. She was here, in this warm, wood-smoke-scented sanctuary, and she was breathing. When the hunter returned, covered in a fresh layer of snow, carrying 3 frozen snow hares by their hind legs, she was dressed in her dry clothes, sitting quietly on a stool by the fire, feeding small pieces of kindling into the flames. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. He took the hares to a small counter near the back of the room, pulled a thin, incredibly sharp knife from his belt, and began the messy, necessary work of skinning and cleaning the animals. She watched him. She observed the practiced ease of his hands, the way he respected the animal, wasting nothing. He separated the meat, the bones for broth, the internal organs for bait or immediate consumption, and carefully stretched the pelts over small wooden frames to dry. It was a brutal, bloody chore, yet he performed it with a quiet, almost reverent focus. She realized, watching him, that this was his life. He was completely self-sufficient, existing in perfect, isolated harmony with the lethal environment outside. He did not need her. She was a massive drain on his resources, a sudden, heavy burden he had chosen to bear for absolutely no logical reason. When he finished, he wiped his knife clean on a rag, washed his hands in a basin, and brought the fresh meat to the fire. He skewered several thick cuts onto a long iron spit and positioned it over the hottest coals. The smell of searing meat quickly filled the cabin, rich and intoxicating. He sat down in his chair opposite her, staring into the flames. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the sizzling of the fat hitting the coals and the unending roar of the wind. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was harsh, entirely unused, raspy from the cold and the silence. It sounded like grinding stones, her accent thick and guttural. It was the first word she had spoken to him. He did not look at her immediately. He reached out with the iron poker, adjusting the spit slightly to ensure the meat cooked evenly. "Why what?" he replied, his voice calm, rumbling. "Why bring me here?" she managed, forcing the unfamiliar words out. "Why give me your fire, your food? I am—" She hesitated, the cultural conditioning deeply ingrained. "I am nothing. Broken. Exile." He finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes caught the firelight, reflecting the dancing flames. He looked at her for a long, heavy moment, studying the fierce, proud angles of her face, the defiant set of her jaw, the vulnerability hiding deep within her amber eyes. "I saw a body in the snow," he said slowly, deliberately. "The snow does not care if you are in exile. It does not care if you are a king, or a hunter, or an orc. It only cares that you are warm, and it wants to make you cold." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I fight the cold. That is what I do. You were fighting it too. You were losing. I offered aid." "But I can offer nothing," she insisted, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No gold, no strength, no clan?" The hunter let out a low, huffing breath that might have been a laugh, though his face remained perfectly serious. "I have no use for gold here. I have my own strength. And clans are loud, messy things that draw too much attention." He reached out and turned the spit again. "You are alive. That is enough. The debt is paid by simply breathing." It was an utterly alien concept to her. In her life, every interaction was a transaction, an exchange of power, respect, or resources. To be given life with no expectation of repayment was baffling. She stared at him, trying to find the deception in his face, but found only the calm, unyielding solidity of a mountain. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, staring deeply into the fire. She did not fully believe him, not yet. But the seed of trust had been planted in the warm, ash-covered earth of the cabin. The days bled into weeks, a slow, continuous cycle of survival and shared silence. The great storm finally broke on the 7th day, leaving behind a world transformed into a blinding, crystalline wonderland, buried under feet of pristine, untouched powder. The temperature remained brutally, lethally low, but the sky cleared, revealing a piercing, brilliant blue that hurt the eyes. With the breaking of the storm, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. The hunter began to spend more time outside, digging out his woodpile, checking a wider circuit of snares, and hunting for larger game. He would leave before dawn, a massive, fur-clad shadow slipping into the frozen world, and return just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, carrying the day's harvest. She, in turn, began to take on the weight of the cabin. She was not a guest. She refused to be a useless burden. As her strength returned, her powerful muscles rebuilding their lost density, she took over the domestic chores. It was an unspoken arrangement, falling naturally into place without a single word of planning. When he returned, exhausted and half-frozen, he found the fire roaring, the cabin warm, and a pot of thick, hearty stew bubbling over the coals. He found his heavy, snow-soaked boots moved closer to the hearth to dry. his spare tunics neatly folded, the floors swept clean of ash and tracked in snow. She learned the rhythm of his life. She learned exactly how much wood was needed to keep the cabin comfortable without wasting their precious stockpile. She learned which herbs he preferred in his tea, discovering a small stash of dried mint he kept hidden away, and brewing it for him on particularly bitter nights. She learned how to mend his torn clothes, her thick green fingers surprisingly deft with a bone needle and heavy sinew thread, patching a tear in his leather tunic with neat, tight, perfect stitches. He noticed everything. He never offered effusive thanks, but his appreciation was clear in his actions. He would take the mended tunic, run his thumb over the flawless stitching, and give her a long, silent nod before putting it on. He began leaving the choice cuts of meat for her, placing the tenderest portions of venison in her bowl. He brought her small things from the outside world, a perfectly smooth, dark river stone, a handful of bright red winter berries that managed to survive the freeze, a bundle of sweet-smelling cedar branches to toss onto the fire. They communicated entirely through these small, deliberate actions, a silent dialogue of mutual respect and growing care. The silence between them, initially tense and fraught with her suspicion, gradually transformed. It became comfortable, a thick, warm blanket that enveloped them both. They did not need to fill the air with meaningless chatter. They sat by the fire in the evenings, he carving small, intricate figures out of soft pine, she methodically sharpening his spare knives with the whetstone, completely at ease in each other's presence. The physical reality of their shared space forced a profound intimacy. The cabin was small. They brushed past one another constantly, moving around the table, tending the hearth. In the beginning, she had flinched violently at every accidental contact, shrinking away from his large frame. But as the weeks turned into a month, the flinching stopped. When he reached across her to grab a log for the fire, his arm brushing her shoulder, she did not move away. She felt the heavy, solid heat of him through his wool tunic, a grounding, comforting pressure. When she handed him a bowl of stew, their fingers would brush, calloused skin against rough olive knuckles. The contact would linger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a tiny spark of electricity jumping between them before they simultaneously withdrew, both fiercely focusing on their food. The emotional thawing was infinitely slower than the physical one, but it was happening, undeniable and powerful. The hunter, a man who had intentionally isolated himself from the world, found his gaze lingering on her more often. He watched the way the firelight caught the sharp curve of her tusks, the deep, rich green of her skin returning to its full, healthy vibrancy. He watched the powerful fluid grace of her movements as she swept the floor or kneaded dough for flatbread, her muscles working with terrifying efficiency. He found himself anticipating the sound of her low, rumbling hum as she worked, a sound that filled the previously empty silence of his home. He realized with a quiet, solid certainty that he did not want her to leave. The thought of returning to the absolute echoing solitude of his past life was suddenly, sharply painful. For the orc girl, the transformation was a complete restructuring of her reality. She had been raised in a world of violence, dominance, and constant brutal struggle. The hunter was the antithesis of everything she knew. He possessed immense physical power, enough to crush her if he chose. Yet he wielded it with profound gentleness. He never raised his voice, never demanded obedience, never tried to assert dominance over her. He treated her not as a subordinate, not as a broken exile, but as an equal partner in their daily battle against the winter. She found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. She memorized the heavy lines of his face, the gray in his beard, the permanent squint of his eyes from years of staring across glaring snowfields. She watched the slow, methodical rise and fall of his chest as he slept in the heavy wooden bed, while she remained on the thick furs near the hearth. She felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness blossoming in her chest, an instinct that was entirely new to her. She wanted to stand between him and the cold. She wanted to ensure his fire never went out. The climax of this slow, excruciatingly quiet build occurred on the night of the deep freeze. It was a phenomenon the hunter knew well, a night when the temperature dropped so rapidly, so precipitously that the very air seemed to crack and splinter. The trees outside exploded like rifle shots as their sap froze solid, and the cold radiated through the heavy log walls, overpowering the hearth. They were sitting in their usual spots by the fire, the cabin unusually chilly despite the massive blaze roaring in the grate. The hunter was meticulously applying a thick layer of rendered animal fat to his heavy leather boots, waterproofing them for the morrow. She was sitting on her furs, wrapping a heavy woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders, shivering slightly as a draft snuck beneath the door. He stopped his work, looking up at her. He saw the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way she pulled the shawl tighter. He looked around the cabin, noting the thick layer of frost creeping up the inside of the windows, rapidly encroaching on the clear glass. "The fire is losing," he stated calmly, setting the boot and the rag aside. He stood up and walked to the corner, pulling another heavy, thick direwolf pelt from his chest. He carried it over to the hearth. He did not go back to his chair. Instead, he sat down on the floor, on the very edge of her woven rug, placing himself directly between her and the draft from the door. He arranged the heavy wolf pelt over his lap, his broad back acting as a massive physical shield against the encroaching chill. She stared at him, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs, a frantic, heavy rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. He was close. Closer than they had ever sat by the fire. She could feel the immense radiant heat of his body, a solid furnace of warmth beside her. He did not look at her. He stared into the flames, his hands resting on his knees. "Sit closer," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The heat pools here. We need to conserve it." It was a practical request, rooted entirely in survival. Yet the air between them suddenly felt incredibly thick, charged with an unspoken tension that was far heavier than the winter outside. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She uncurled her legs and slid closer to him, stopping only when her shoulder was a hair's breadth from his arm. The difference was immediate and profound. The heat radiating from his massive frame, combined with the direct warmth of the fire, created an impenetrable pocket of comfort. They sat there for a long time, staring into the dancing flames, the silence stretching out, heavy and absolute. The trees outside continued to crack and pop like distant artillery, the wind howling its frustration against the heavy walls. But inside their small circle of heat, the world was perfectly still. Slowly, deliberately, the hunter moved his hand. He uncurled his fingers from his knee and placed his large, calloused hand flat on the rug, bridging the tiny gap between them. He did not touch her, but his hand was there, an invitation, a silent declaration of presence. She looked down at his hand. She saw the scars, the heavy knuckles, the dirt ingrained in the lines of his skin. It was a hand that had taken life, chopped wood, skinned animals. It was a harsh hand. And yet, it was the hand that had pulled her from the snow. It was the hand that had wiped the fever sweat from her brow. It was the hand that had brought her back to life. She reached out, her movement agonizingly slow, her heart pounding a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She moved her hand and placed it gently over his. Her skin was a deep, rich olive green, smooth and incredibly warm, contrasting sharply against the pale, scarred, weathered skin of his hand. She did not interlock their fingers. She simply let her hand rest atop his, a solid, grounding weight. The hunter exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to release a tension he had been carrying for years. He did not pull away. He turned his hand slowly, opening his palm, and gently, carefully closed his thick fingers around hers. His grip was firm, secure, lacking any crushing pressure, just a solid, unyielding promise of presence. He turned his head to look at her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, but his eyes were bright, warm, and entirely open. "It's freezing," the hunter murmured, repeating the very first words he had ever spoken to her, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, feeling the rough texture of her skin. She looked back at him, her amber eyes glowing in the dark. A slow, incredibly soft smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, revealing the sharp points of her tusks. It was the first time she had smiled since the day of her banishment. A fragile, beautiful expression that completely transformed her fierce features. "Not here," the banished orc girl replied, her guttural voice softening, barely a whisper over the crackle of the logs. She leaned slightly, letting her shoulder rest against his massive, solid arm, feeling the steady, powerful thud of his heart beneath the wool. "Not anymore." They turned their gaze back to the hearth, their hands locked together in the space between them. Outside, the winter raged, a chaotic, lethal force that sought to consume the world in ice and darkness. But inside the heavy log walls, they had built a sanctuary. And as the flames danced and snapped, casting their warm golden light over the unyielding hunter and the unbroken exile, it was undeniably clear that the fire they had built, through patience, silence, and quiet devotion, warmed infinitely more than just the cabin.